Aaron sat on the worn leather armchair in his home office, the faint hum of his computer breaking the heavy silence. He stared at the glowing screen but saw nothing, his thoughts consumed by Stephanie's vague excuses. Just a few hours earlier, she'd mentioned needing to work late with a coworker, but the way her eyes darted and her voice tightened struck a wrong chord. The air in the house felt heavy, saturated with doubt. Aaron clenched his jaw, his mind racing back to the small but nagging inconsistencies that had surfaced in recent weeks. The late-night text messages she shielded from his view, the sudden interest in her appearance, new outfits, fresh highlights in her hair, and tonight, the insistence that he shouldn't worry about her late meeting. His gut churned. Aaron had always trusted Stephanie. For 13 years of marriage, he'd prided himself on their open communication, their shared dreams, their stability. But this shadow of suspicion was foreign and unsettling. He pushed back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He needed answers. So, earlier that evening, as Stephanie had brushed past him in the hallway, the faint scent of her expensive perfume lingered. She had looked radiant, almost glowing. "Don't wait up," she had said with a quick peck on his cheek, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The gesture had been routine, but something in her voice too casual, too rehearsed pricked at his instincts. Aaron grabbed his phone, scrolling through a tracking app he'd installed months ago. It wasn't paranoia. He told himself at the time. It was practicality. Their city wasn't the safest, and knowing where Stephanie was brought him peace of mind. Tonight, it was something more. He tapped the app, his heart pounding as the map loaded. The little blue dot that represented her car didn't sit at the office building downtown where she claimed to be. Instead, it was at the Riverside Suites Hotel, a 15-minute drive away. The name blazed on the map like a beacon, mocking him. Aaron's stomach tightened. 1,000 scenarios played in his mind, each more damning than the last. He grabbed his jacket, keys, and wallet, his movements precise but trembling. This wasn't just about suspicion, it was about confirmation. He needed to see it for himself. The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to calm the storm within. The drive was a blur of streetlights and clenched fists on the steering wheel as he pulled into the hotel parking lot. His breath hitched. There was Stephanie's car. Her familiar silver sedan was parked in a shadowed corner, as if hiding from the world. Aaron sat there for a moment, the engine idling. His mind waged war between wanting to storm inside and demanding answers, or retreating, hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding. He killed the engine and stepped out, his resolve hardening. Tonight, he would uncover the truth. Aaron adjusted his collar as he walked through the hotel's glass doors, his reflection in the polished surfaces barely registering. The muted ambience of the lobby, soft piano music, the piano of expensive candles clashed with the storm brewing inside him. He forced himself to breathe deeply, masking his fury behind an exterior of calm. He didn't want to attract attention just yet. The receptionist, a young man in a neatly pressed suit, looked up from behind the desk and smiled politely. Aaron approached, his casual demeanor betraying nothing. "Evening," Aaron began, pulling out his wallet. "I believe my wife checked in earlier. I wanted to make sure everything's in order. Stephanie Wright. She'd be under my card." He smiled faintly, hoping his voice sounded steady. The receptionist hesitated, tapping at the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't disclose information about our guests without their approval." Aaron nodded as if he understood, though his mind boiled. "Of course, totally get it." "Thanks anyway." He stepped back, his lips pressing into a thin line. Plan A wasn't going to work, but that didn't mean Plan B wouldn't. He settled into a plush armchair near the elevator, pulling out his phone. The hotel's website showed a list of available amenities and services, but his eyes drifted to the tracker app. Stephanie's car hadn't moved, which meant she was still inside. His gaze shifted to the elevator as the doors slid open with a soft chime. A man stepped out, tall and sharply dressed in a navy suit. Aaron's heart stopped when he recognized the man from Stephanie's office holiday party 2 years ago. Chris. A coworker she had laughed about at the time, harmless, she'd said. Chris strolled through the lobby with the ease of someone who belonged there. Aaron's stomach clenched when Chris glanced over his shoulder, smiling toward the elevator. As if on cue, Stephanie appeared. She stepped out, radiant in a fitted black dress that Aaron hadn't seen before. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, her makeup flawless. She was smiling. A carefree laugh spilling out as she linked arms with Chris. Aaron froze, every fiber of his being screaming at him to confront them. But he didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With trembling fingers, he snapped a picture as they passed through the lobby and headed toward the bar. For a moment, he felt the world tilt under him. There was no ambiguity now, no plausible excuses or explanations. The evidence was in front of him. The way Stephanie leaned into Chris, the way he touched the small of her back, it was intimate, deliberate. He waited until they settled into a corner booth, ordering drinks and laughing over shared conversation. His grip tightened around his phone. Every second he watched felt like a dagger twisting deeper. He considered storming over, ending this charade right there, but he knew it wasn't time. Instead, Aaron focused on gathering evidence. He circled the lobby, snapping a few more photos from different angles. When they clinked their glasses and Chris leaned closer to whisper something, Aaron caught it all. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind remained sharp. He needed more than just anger, he needed proof. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour. Eventually, Stephanie and Chris stood, their faces lit with that unmistakable look of anticipation. They headed toward the elevators, oblivious to the storm brewing behind them. Aaron followed at a distance, his breath shallow, his every step deliberate. Chris pressed the button for the elevator, and when the doors slid open, Stephanie stepped inside first. Chris followed, his hand brushing hers. Aaron's jaw tightened as the elevator doors closed. In that moment, he made his decision. He wasn't just going to walk away. He wasn't going to rage blindly. He was going to act. Calculated. Decisive. The fire of betrayal had ignited something in him, a resolve that would ensure they paid for what they'd done. For now, though, he needed to know where they were headed. He turned to the receptionist's desk once more, his tone steady, but cool. "Excuse me, can you call up room service? I'd like to send a bottle of champagne to room 306. The receptionist hesitated, his brows furrowing. "Sir, how do you?" Aaron smiled, cutting him off. "My wife mentioned it when she texted me earlier. I wanted to surprise her. Please, it's a special night." The receptionist seemed convinced, nodding as he picked up the phone. As he dialed, Aaron's pulse quickened. Room 306. He had everything he needed. Aaron stepped back toward the elevator, his heart steady now. This wasn't the time for chaos. It was the time for control. What awaited him on the other side of that door would change everything, but he would make sure it ended on his terms. Aaron stood outside room 306, his fists clenched at his sides. He could hear faint laughter through the door, muffled voices that confirmed he was in the right place. His pulse was a steady drumbeat in his ears, but his mind was sharper than it had been in days. He wasn't here to lose control. He was here to end the facade. He slipped his phone into his pocket, ensuring the camera app was open and ready. The pictures he'd taken downstairs had been damning enough, but what he was about to capture would leave no room for excuses. With a deep breath, Aaron raised his hand and knocked on the door. The voices inside paused. A muffled "Did you order something?" floated through the door, followed by a shuffle of feet. Aaron stepped back, bracing himself as the door creaked open. Chris stood there, his expensive shirt untucked, his confident smile faltering the moment he recognized Aaron. Chris began, his brow furrowing. "Aaron, right? Stephanie's husband." His voice carried a nervous edge. Aaron gave a tight smile. "That's right, Chris. Surprised to see me." Chris opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Aaron shoved past him, stepping into the room. The air inside was heavy with perfume and wine. A bottle of champagne sat half empty on the table next to two glasses. And there on the couch was Stephanie. She froze when she saw Aaron, her eyes wide with panic. She wore the same sleek black dress he'd seen her in downstairs, though now it looked more like a costume, her mask of sophistication slipping under his piercing gaze. "Aaron," she stammered, rising to her feet. "What are you doing here?" Aaron's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fury. "Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing." Stephanie glanced at Chris, who was still lingering by the door, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "This isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, stepping toward Aaron with her hands outstretched. "I can explain." Aaron let out a bitter laugh, the sound slicing through the tension in the room. "It's exactly what it looks like, Stephanie. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Chris, regaining some of his composure, shut the door behind him. "Look, man," he started, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "This doesn't have to get ugly. Let's just talk about this like adults." Aaron turned to him, his expression icy. "Talk about what, Chris? The fact that you're sleeping with my wife? Or the fact that you two thought you could get away with it?" Chris flinched but held his ground. "It's not like that," he said, though the guilt on his face betrayed him. Aaron ignored him, focusing on Stephanie. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Stephanie's lips trembled, her polished exterior crumbling. It's not serious, Aaron. It doesn't mean anything. Aaron's laugh this time was harsher. Not serious. You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and meeting him in hotel rooms, and you want me to believe it doesn't mean anything. Stephanie's eyes darted to the champagne bottle, the room, and finally to Chris, as if searching for an escape. It's just, I've been feeling neglected, she blurted out. You're always so focused on work. I felt invisible. Aaron shook his head, his jaw tightening. So your solution was to betray me, to destroy everything we built together. Don't you dare try to blame me for your choices. Chris stepped forward, his hand still raised. Hey, look, man, I get it. You're upset, but maybe this is a sign things weren't working between you two. Maybe it's for the best. Aaron's eyes snapped to Chris, his calm cracking. You don't get to tell me what's best for my marriage. He took a step toward him, forcing Chris to back away. You're a coward who preyed on a married woman. You knew exactly what you were doing. Chris raised his hands higher, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Okay, I'll leave. This is between you two. He moved toward the door, but Aaron stepped in his path. Oh no, you're staying, Aaron said coldly. You don't get to walk away from this. Not until I've said my piece. Stephanie tried again. Aaron, please. Let's just go home and talk about this. We can fix it. Aaron turned to her, his eyes filled with pain and anger. Fix it? Stephanie, there's no fixing this. I trusted you. I loved you. And this is how you repay me? Stephanie began to cry, her tears streaking her perfectly applied makeup. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. Aaron pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up, snapping a picture of the scene before him, Chris's guilty face, Stephanie's tear-streaked one. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice hard. This is about the truth, and I'm not letting either of you escape it. He turned back to Chris. You can leave now, but don't think for a second that I won't make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done. Chris hesitated, then nodded and slipped out the door without another word. The room fell silent except for Stephanie's quiet sobs. Aaron stared at her for a moment, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The door clicked shut behind Aaron as he stepped out of room 306, leaving Stephanie and her shattered excuses behind him. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The hallway was eerily silent, the kind of stillness that felt oppressive, and the dim lighting did nothing to calm the storm in his mind. His grip tightened around his phone as if it were a lifeline. It wasn't over yet. Aaron stood outside the elevator, watching the glowing numbers descend and ascend as it ferried guests to their destinations. He couldn't bring himself to press the button. Not yet. Instead, he paced the carpeted hallway, each step deliberate, as he replayed the scene in his head. Stephanie's tears, Chris's cowardice, it all felt surreal. He had dreamed of their betrayal in countless ways during the nights his suspicions grew, but now that it had unfolded in real time, it felt both worse and strangely anticlimactic. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't breaking things. Instead, there was a hollow calmness within him, as though his emotions had burned out from the sheer intensity of the fire earlier. The elevator door slid open with a soft ding, snapping him out of his thoughts. A middle-aged couple stepped out, their laughter bubbling between them as they passed him by arm in arm. Their happiness was a reminder of what Aaron once had or thought he had. He clenched his jaw, swallowing the lump forming in his throat, and stepped inside the elevator. As the elevator descended, Aaron took out his phone and scrolled through the photos he had captured. There was no joy in seeing Stephanie's betrayal frozen in time. Each image stabbed at his chest, but it also steeled his resolve. She couldn't deny it now. She couldn't manipulate him or gaslight him into thinking he had imagined things. The truth was undeniable, and it was now his weapon. The elevator doors opened into the lobby where the soft piano music from earlier played on. Aaron's eyes scanned the room, landing on Chris, who was pacing near the bar, speaking animatedly into his phone. Aaron watched him for a moment, his gut twisting with disgust. Chris's gestures were defensive, his body language screaming panic as he ran his hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. Aaron wondered briefly who he was talking to, another mistress. His boss? Stephanie? As Aaron moved toward the exit, his steps slowed, his mind shifting from rage to calculation. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about regaining control. Chris had made the first move by crossing the line, and now it was Aaron's turn. He turned back toward the bar and approached Chris with quiet, measured steps. Chris, Aaron said, his voice low but carrying a weight that froze the man mid-sentence. Chris turned, his face paling as he ended his call abruptly. Aaron, look, I was just. Save it, Aaron interrupted, holding up a hand. His calmness startled even him. I'm not here to argue. I've got nothing to say to you that you haven't already heard upstairs. Chris opened his mouth, but Aaron leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. What you should know, though, is that I'm not letting this slide. You don't get to waltz into my life, ruin my marriage, and walk away unscathed. Chris stammered, his confidence faltering. It wasn't like that. Stephanie, she came to me. I didn't. Aaron's eyes narrowed. You didn't what? Didn't know she was married? Didn't think you'd get caught? Don't lie to me. I've already got more evidence than you can imagine. Chris swallowed hard, glancing nervously around the room. Look, man, I didn't mean for things to get this complicated. I'll back off, okay? I'll leave her alone. Aaron's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. You think that fixes anything? You think walking away erases what you've done? He stepped closer, his voice steady and sharp. This isn't about you leaving her alone. This is about you answering for what you've done. You've built your reputation on charm and manipulation, but I'll make sure people see the real you. Chris faltered, the usual arrogance in his posture replaced by unease. What do you want from me? Aaron leaned back, his expression unreadable. What I want is for you to remember this moment when everything starts crumbling around you. Your reputation, your career, everything you've worked for, I'll see to it that you lose it all. Without waiting for a response, Aaron turned and walked away, his resolve strengthening with each step. As he exited the hotel into the cool night air, he inhaled deeply, letting the crisp breeze fill his lungs. The stars overhead twinkled indifferently, a stark contrast to the chaos he just left behind. Aaron got into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The drive home was quiet, the city lights passing by like a blur. His mind wasn't on Stephanie or Chris anymore. It was on what came next. He wasn't just going to walk away from this a victim. He was going to reclaim his life, his dignity, and his future. As he pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the car, Aaron looked up at the house he built with Stephanie. The home that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a hollow shell. But that was about to change. He wasn't the kind of man who let betrayal define him. No, this was just the beginning of a new chapter one where he controlled the narrative. Aaron sat at his kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the curtains. The house was silent now, every corner feeling empty and unfamiliar. Stephanie had moved out 2 days ago, taking only the essentials. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. But Aaron wasn't mourning anymore. He had done enough of that in the sleepless hours following the confrontation. Now, it was time to rebuild. His coffee sat untouched as he scrolled through his phone, reviewing the messages he had drafted. One was to Stephanie's parents, letting them know about the divorce and the reasons behind it. Another was to their mutual friends, people who had seen them as the perfect couple. Aaron was careful in his wording, honest but not vindictive. The facts would speak for themselves. He wasn't seeking pity or validation, he was seeking closure. The divorce lawyer, Clara, had been precise and efficient. She commended him for collecting irrefutable evidence and acting swiftly. This will ensure you aren't blindsided, she had said during their last meeting. Stephanie had been blindsided, though. The divorce papers hit her harder than Aaron expected, despite the undeniable proof of her betrayal. When she called him, sobbing and pleading, he had listened in silence. There was no satisfaction in hearing her regret. If anything, it felt hollow. Aaron's mind wandered to the confrontation, replaying her words. It didn't mean anything she had said, but it meant something to him. It had meant dismantling years of trust, love, and shared memories. He realized now that there was no point in trying to understand her actions. The why didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the life ahead of him. He glanced at the stack of papers Clara had given him, legal documents, financial disclosures, and a list of steps to prepare for life post-divorce. Among them was a suggestion to seek therapy. At first, he dismissed the idea. Therapy had always seemed unnecessary to him, a crutch for people who couldn't manage on their own. But as the hours passed, the thought lingered. Maybe he didn't need to manage on his own. Maybe it was okay to ask for help. That afternoon, Aaron booked his first session with a therapist. He felt a strange mix of apprehension and relief. The idea of sharing his emotions with a stranger felt daunting, but he knew he couldn't carry the weight of his anger and grief forever. He wanted to let it go, to move forward without bitterness gnawing at him. His first session was unexpectedly cathartic. The therapist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, listened as he poured out his story. For the first time, Aaron spoke freely, without fear of judgment. He talked about the betrayal, the confrontation, and the deep sense of loss that followed. The therapist didn't offer instant solutions or platitudes. Instead, she asked questions that forced him to reflect, to dig deeper into his feelings. By the end of the session, Aaron felt lighter, as if he had set down a burden he'd been carrying for weeks. The following days brought more changes. Aaron began reclaiming his space, rearranging items that no longer brought him joy and painting the living room a warm shade of blue. Each small change felt like a step toward healing, a declaration that this was his home now, not theirs. He also reconnected with old friends he had drifted from during his marriage. They welcomed him back with open arms, offering support without prying into the details. One evening, Aaron found himself sitting by the lake near his house, watching the sunset. The water shimmered in hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. The betrayal still hurt, it probably always would, but it no longer defined him. He wasn't the man who had been cheated on. He was the man who had faced the truth, confronted the lies, and taken control of his life. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and Aaron closed his eyes, letting the calm wash over him. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. He didn't know what it would hold: new love, new adventures, or simply quiet contentment, but he knew he was ready for it. For the first time in a long time, Aaron felt hope, not for what was lost, but for what was still to come.